Baby discovered a bear cub, hidden in a police station, lost and found. What happened next was epic. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight in the small town of Cedar Ridge, creating rivers along the sidewalks and turning the world into a blur of gray and silver. Officer Ethan Marshall stood by the window of the police station, watching the droplets race down the glass while his coffee grew cold in his hands. It was one of those afternoons where time seemed to move differently, slower somehow, as if the universe itself was taking a deep breath. The station was quieter than usual, with most of the officers out on patrol or finishing paperwork in their offices. The lost and found room sat at the end of the hallway, a place most people forgot existed until they needed something they'd misplaced. Today, that room would become the center of something extraordinary, though nobody knew it yet. Lily Morgan pushed through the station's front door, her baby balanced on her hip while she struggled with an umbrella that refused to close properly. The child, barely 8 months old, had eyes that seemed too wise for someone so young, watching everything with an intensity that made people pause. She approached the front desk where Ethan had just returned, setting down his coffee with a gentle clink against the wooden surface. "I'm looking for my grandmother's locket," she said, her voice carrying a hint of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights with a young child. "I filed a report last week about losing it near the park." Ethan nodded, remembering the report vaguely, and offered to check the lost and found room personally. Something about the way the baby stared at him, unblinking and curious, made him want to help more than usual. The lost and found room smelled of dust and forgotten memories, filled with boxes and shelves containing items that told stories of carelessness or misfortune. Umbrellas leaned against the wall like tired soldiers, while a collection of single gloves waited hopefully for their partners. Ethan began searching through the jewelry box where they kept smaller valuable items, while Lily stood in the doorway, gently bouncing her baby, who had begun to make soft cooing sounds. The sounds weren't random, though. They had a pattern, almost like the child was trying to communicate something specific. "She's been doing that all morning," Lily said, a slight smile crossing her tired face. "Sometimes I think she knows things we don't." Ethan chuckled softly, continuing his search through the various compartments of the jewelry box, finding rings and watches but no locket matching the description Lily had given. As he moved to check another shelf, the baby's sounds grew more insistent, and she began reaching toward the back corner of the room where older items were stored. Her tiny fingers stretched and grasped at the air, and her sounds became almost urgent, though not distressed. Lily tried to calm her, but the child wouldn't settle, twisting in her mother's arms to keep pointing at that specific corner. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily asked, following her baby's gaze to where shadows gathered around stacks of boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. Ethan noticed the interaction and felt something strange, a pull he couldn't explain, drawing him toward that corner as well. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting dancing shadows that made the ordinary room feel suddenly mysterious. Among the dusty boxes sat an old wooden crate, different from the cardboard and plastic containers around it. The wood was dark, aged to a deep brown that spoke of decades, maybe longer. Strange symbols were carved into its surface. Not quite letters, but not quite pictures either, creating patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. The baby's sounds had become almost musical now, a gentle humming that filled the small room with an unexpected warmth. Ethan reached for the crate, surprised to find it wasn't as heavy as it looked, and carefully lifted it onto a nearby table. The lock had long since broken, hanging uselessly from a rusted latch that crumbled slightly at his touch. "This has been here since before I started," he said quietly, more to himself than to Lily. "I don't think anyone's opened it in years." The lid creaked as he lifted it, releasing a scent that was impossible to place. Something between pine forest and starlight, if starlight had a smell. Inside, nestled among what looked like old wool blankets, something moved. Not quickly or suddenly, but with a gentle shifting that suggested sleep disturbed rather than alarm. Ethan stepped back instinctively, his hand moving to his radio, but he didn't call for backup. Something told him this wasn't a threat, though his logical mind screamed that finding something alive in a box that had been sealed for years was impossible. Lily gasped softly, clutching her baby tighter, but she didn't run. Instead, she stepped closer, drawn by the same inexplicable force that kept Ethan rooted to the spot. A small head emerged from the blankets, covered in fur so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Two eyes opened slowly, revealing depths of brown so rich they looked like liquid amber in the fluorescent lighting. It was a bear cub, impossibly small and impossibly calm, regarding them with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The baby in Lily's arms laughed, a pure sound of delight that broke the spell of silence that had fallen over the room. The cub turned its attention to the child, and something passed between them, a recognition or understanding that defied explanation. Around the cub's neck was a collar, not rough or restraining, but soft leather worked with the same strange symbols that decorated the box. Ethan's training told him to call animal control immediately, to follow protocol and ensure everyone's safety. But his training hadn't prepared him for the way the cub simply sat there, patient and peaceful, as if it had been waiting for them specifically. The creature couldn't have been more than a few months old, far too young to survive on its own, yet it showed no signs of distress or hunger. Its fur was clean and well-groomed, and its eyes held a clarity that spoke of good health. "How is this possible?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle hum of the heating system. The baby reached out again, and this time Lily didn't pull her back. Tiny fingers touched soft fur, and the cub made a sound that was almost like a purr. Though bears don't purr. At least, they're not supposed to. The collar bore a small metal tag alongside the strange symbols, and Ethan leaned closer to read it, careful not to startle the unusual visitor. The tag was old, the metal tarnished but still legible. It read simply, Ursa, and below that, a date from 3 days ago. 3 days ago, when the rain had started. 3 days ago, when old Samuel Hayes had passed away in his sleep at the age of 93. Ethan knew Samuel. Everyone in Cedar Ridge did. The old man had been the town's unofficial astronomer, setting up his telescope in the park on clear nights, teaching children about constellations and telling stories about the stars. He lived alone in a cottage at the edge of town, and when he died, they'd found his house exactly as he'd left it. Everything in perfect order except for one thing. His constant companion, a creature he'd mentioned but nobody had ever seen, was missing. Samuel's friend, Ethan said softly, pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind. Samuel had talked about raising an orphaned cub he'd found years ago, but everyone assumed it was one of his stories, the kind old people tell when loneliness becomes too heavy. The man had permits, Ethan remembered now, special wildlife permits that nobody questioned because Samuel had connections from his younger days working with conservation groups. But seeing the cub here, in this box that had supposedly been in the station for years, made no sense. Unless Samuel had somehow placed it here recently, knowing his time was ending, trusting that the right person would find his beloved companion. The baby made another sound, and the cub responded with a gentle snuff, standing on unsteady legs and padding closer to the edge of the box. In the better light, Ethan could see more details. The cub's paws were larger than they should be for its size, suggesting it would grow much bigger, and there was a pattern in its fur, subtle but present, that looked almost like constellation maps. Lily sat down on a nearby chair, her baby still reaching for the cub with determination that wouldn't be denied. "We can't just leave it here," she said, stating what they both were thinking. The cub needed care, needed someone who understood that it wasn't just any bear, but Samuel's bear, raised with love and intelligence that had made it more than wild, though not quite tame either. Ethan thought about calling his supervisor, about following proper channels and doing everything by the book. But the book didn't have a chapter for this. The book didn't explain how a bear cub could appear in a box that predated its existence, or why a baby seemed to communicate with it, or why the symbols on the collar matched those on the box perfectly, despite supposedly being separated by decades. He made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. "There's more in the box," he said, noticing papers tucked beneath the blankets. Old papers, yellowed with age but somehow also new, as if time itself had gotten confused in this small room. The first paper was a photograph, black and white but crystal clear, showing a younger Samuel Hayes standing next to a massive telescope. Beside him sat a bear, fully grown and majestic, wearing the same collar that the cub now wore. But the photograph was dated 1962, which was impossible because Samuel would have been just a child then. Unless the bear in the photo wasn't the same bear, but an ancestor, and the collar was something passed down through generations. The thought made Ethan's head spin with possibilities that science said couldn't exist, but his eyes insisted were real. The baby had grown quiet, watching the cub with an intensity that seemed beyond her months, as if she understood something the adults were still trying to grasp, and more papers revealed themselves as Ethan carefully lifted them from the box. Journal entries in Samuel's distinctive handwriting, talking about the stars and their patterns, about ancient beliefs that certain animals could bridge the gap between earth and sky. He wrote about finding the first cub 60 years ago, about raising it with the knowledge passed down from indigenous peoples who understood that some creatures were more than they appeared. He wrote about the collar, crafted by hands that knew secrets modern society had forgotten, and about the promise that there would always be a guardian, always be a bridge between the wild and the civilized, as long as someone remembered to look for the signs. The cub had settled again, curling into a ball that rose and fell with steady breathing. It trusted them completely, or perhaps it simply knew what Samuel had known, that kindness finds kindness, that those who are meant to help will appear when needed. Lily's baby had fallen asleep, one tiny hand still stretched toward the cub, and in the quiet of the afternoon, the 3 humans and 1 small bear existed in a bubble of impossible peace. The rain continued outside, tapping against the windows like Morse code, spelling out messages that only the universe could read. Ethan found himself thinking about his own grandfather, who told him stories about animals that weren't quite animals, about times when the boundary between human and nature was thinner, more permeable. "There's a phone number here," Lily said, having picked up one of the papers while Ethan was lost in thought. The number was written in a different hand, feminine and flowing, with a note that said simply, "When you find Ursa, call me. I've been waiting." The area code was local, and something about the certainty in those words, the assumption that Ursa would be found rather than if, made Ethan reach for his phone without hesitation. As he dialed, he wondered who would answer, what voice would speak from the other end of this strange thread that seemed to connect past and present, wild and tame, possible and impossible. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered, elderly but strong, carrying the kind of authority that comes from knowing things others don't. "You found him," the voice said, not a question, but a statement. "I'm Samuel's sister, Margaret. I've been waiting for your call." Ethan hadn't known Samuel had a sister, but then there seemed to be a lot about Samuel that the town hadn't known. Margaret continued without waiting for a response. "I'm 10 minutes away. Don't move him yet. There are things you need to know, things Samuel wanted someone to know, and somehow I think you're the right person to hear them." While they waited, Ethan and Lily sat in comfortable silence, watching the cubs sleep. The baby had woken but remained quiet, her eyes moving between the adults and the small bear with an awareness that seemed impossible for her age. The lost and found room had transformed from a forgotten corner of the station into something magical, a place where time bent and rules relaxed, where impossible things became simply improbable, and improbable things became everyday miracles. The fluorescent lights had stopped flickering, casting steady light that somehow seemed softer than before. And the rain outside had gentled to a whisper that sounded almost like a lullaby. Margaret arrived exactly 10 minutes later, moving with purpose despite her obvious age. She was tall and straight-backed, with silver hair pulled into a bun and eyes the same amber as the cubs. She entered the lost and found room as if she'd been there before, as if she knew exactly where to look and what to find. Her gaze fell on the cub immediately, and her stern expression softened into something that might have been love, or might have been grief, or might have been both. "Hello, little one," she said softly, and the cub stirred, opening its eyes and making a sound that was definitely recognition. "Samuel raised 3 generations of them," she said, turning to Ethan and Lily. "Always bears, always special, always more than they seemed." She reached into her bag and pulled out another photograph, this one in color but faded with age. It showed Samuel as Ethan remembered him, elderly and kind, sitting in his cottage with a full-grown bear beside him. But in the background, barely visible, was another cub, the one that now slept in the box. "This was taken last month," Margaret said, anticipating the question. The mother passed naturally, peacefully, and Samuel knew his own time was coming. He also knew the cub couldn't stay with him, but he couldn't bear to give it to just anyone. So he did what Samuel always did. He trusted in synchronicity, in the idea that the right people would find Ursa when the time was right. "But the box," Ethan started, trying to make sense of the timeline. Margaret smiled, a knowing expression that reminded him of Samuel when he'd talk about the stars. "Has been here for years, yes. Samuel placed it here in 1962, the day the first Ursa died. He knew that someday someone would need to find it, would need to understand. The box exists outside of normal time, you might say. It's been waiting for this moment, for you to open it, for the story to continue." It sounded insane, but looking at the evidence before him, Ethan couldn't argue with what his senses were telling him. The baby in Lily's arms reached out again, and this time Margaret nodded. "She knows," the old woman said simply. "Children always do. They haven't learned yet that some things are impossible." Margaret explained that the bears Samuel raised were descendants of a line that indigenous peoples had considered sacred, bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. The collar was indeed ancient, passed down through generations, and whoever wore it would always find their way to someone who needed them. Samuel needed companionship, she said, and the bears needed someone who understood their nature. But now, Ursa needs something different. He needs to learn to be wild while remaining connected to humanity. He needs someone who can teach him both sides of his heritage. She looked at Ethan meaningfully, and he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar jacket. "I can't keep a bear," Ethan said, though even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't entirely true. His property backed onto forest land, He had the knowledge from years of working with wildlife before becoming a cop, and something in him had already accepted that Ursa was meant to be part of his life. Margaret smiled, as if she could read his thoughts. "Not keep," she corrected. "Guide. There's a difference. Ursa will know when it's time to return to the wild, and he'll know when it's time to return to you. The collar ensures he'll always find his way." She pulled out a thick envelope from her bag, worn and sealed with wax. "Samuel left instructions, everything you need to know. He chose you, Ethan, though he never met you. He knew someone in this station would be the right person, and here you are." Lily had been quiet throughout the explanation, but now she spoke up. "Why did my baby know? Why did she react to the box?" Margaret turned to her with eyes that held centuries of wisdom despite being only 80 years old. Because children remember what adults forget. She recognized Ursa's spirit, the same spirit that's been in every bear Samuel raised. "Your daughter has a gift, Mrs. Morgan, one that will grow with her if you let it. She sees connections others miss, feels threads that bind all living things together." The baby gurgled happily, as if agreeing, and even made a sound that almost matched the soft snuff the cub had made earlier. The afternoon was fading into evening, and decisions needed to be made. Ethan looked at the sleeping cub, at the papers that told an impossible story, at Margaret who waited patiently for him to accept what his heart already knew. "What about the legalities?" he asked, his practical side asserting itself. Margaret pulled out another envelope, this one containing permits, letters from wildlife organizations, and documentation that would satisfy any bureaucracy. "Samuel was thorough," she said. "He spent the last year of his life making sure everything was in order. You'll be listed as a wildlife rehabilitator, working with a special program that technically has existed since 1962. As if sensing the shift in energy, Ursa woke fully, standing and stretching in a way that was purely bear despite the unusual circumstances. He padded to the edge of the box and looked at each person in turn, his gaze lingering on the baby who watched him with equal intensity. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible for something so young, he climbed out of the box and sat at Ethan's feet, looking up with those amber eyes that held more intelligence than any animal should possess. The decision was made without words, accepted by all present as simply the way things were meant to be. Margaret stood to leave, but not before placing a hand on the cub's head in blessing or farewell or both. "Samuel would be happy," she said softly. "He worried about leaving Ursa alone, but he should have known better. The universe doesn't abandon its bridges." She turned to Lily and her baby, studying them for a moment. "You'll see him again," she said cryptically. "Your daughter and Ursa have a connection that will matter someday. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday when it's needed most." With that, she left, moving through the station as if she was walking through a memory, leaving behind the scent of pine and something else, something like starlight. The rain had stopped while they were talking, and the setting sun broke through the clouds, sending golden light through the windows of the lost and found room. It illuminated the dust motes floating in the air, turning them into tiny stars, and for a moment the small room felt infinite. Ethan gathered the papers, the photographs, the impossible documentation of an impossible situation, while Lily stood to leave. "This is extraordinary," she said, and Ethan could only nod. The baby waved at Ursa, who tilted his head in what looked remarkably like a wave back, and then they were gone, leaving Ethan alone with a bear cub that shouldn't exist in a room that had become magical. He looked down at Ursa, who looked back with patient expectation. "I suppose we should go home," Ethan said, and the cub stood, ready to follow wherever this strange new chapter would lead. As they walked through the station, Other officers barely glanced up, as if a man walking with a bear cub was perfectly normal. Or perhaps Margaret was right, and the universe bent around these moments, making the impossible seem mundane to those who weren't meant to see. The front door opened to a world washed clean by rain, sparkling in the last light of day, and Ethan thought about Samuel, about bridges and connections, about the thin places where different worlds touched. The drive home was quiet except for the soft sounds Ursa made, not quite snores but something like contentment given voice. The cub sat in the passenger seat as if he'd done it 1,000 times before, watching the town pass by with interest but not alarm. Ethan found himself talking, explaining where they were going, what would happen next, feeling only slightly foolish for conversing with a bear. But Ursa seemed to listen, his head tilting at certain words, his eyes tracking the movement of Ethan's hands on the steering wheel. By the time they reached the house at the edge of the forest, it felt like they'd known each other for years instead of hours. The house sat on 5 acres of land that bordered National Forest, a place Ethan had bought when he'd thought he might have a family someday. That hadn't happened, but now, watching Ursa explore the front porch with careful curiosity, he wondered if family came in different forms than he'd expected. The cub sniffed at the doormat, investigated the rocking chair Samuel would have loved, and finally sat at the door, waiting politely to be invited in. "This is your home too now," Ethan said, opening the door, and Ursa entered with the dignity of a creature who knew he belonged exactly where he was. That night, Ethan read through Samuel's papers while Ursa slept on a bed of blankets near the fireplace. The old man's handwriting told stories that science would reject but the heart accepted. Tales of bears who could sense illness before doctors, who appeared when someone needed comfort, who knew when storms were coming, not from instinct but from some deeper connection to the earth itself. He wrote about the indigenous peoples who had first recognized these special bears, who had created the collar not to control, but to mark them as bridges, as beings who belonged to both wilderness and civilization. He wrote about teaching each bear to read the stars, though how one taught a bear astronomy was left frustratingly vague. The journal entries grew more personal as they approached the present, talking about loneliness and purpose, about the fear of leaving Ursa without a guardian. But the final entry, dated the day before Samuel died, was peaceful. "I met him today," Samuel had written. "Not in person, but in a dream that wasn't quite a dream. The young officer who will find Ursa. He has the right heart for this, and the ability to see beyond the ordinary. Ursa will teach him what I learned, that magic isn't about defying nature but about understanding it more deeply than most dare to try. The bridge continues, as it always has, as it always will." Ethan set down the journal and looked at Ursa, who had woken and was watching him with those impossible amber eyes. Outside, the stars had emerged, brilliant after the rain, and on impulse, Ethan opened the back door. Ursa padded out onto the deck, sat down, and looked up at the sky with an expression of such profound recognition that Ethan found himself looking up too. There was Ursa Major, the great bear, wheeling overhead in its eternal dance, and for a moment Ethan could swear he saw the constellation reflected in the cub's eyes, as if the stars above and the bear below were connected by invisible threads of light. A week passed in a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Ursa proved to be unlike any animal Ethan had ever encountered. He used the bathroom outside without being taught, ate carefully and cleanly, and seemed to understand complex instructions that should have been beyond a bear's comprehension. More mysteriously, he would sometimes pause in whatever he was doing and look toward town, as if hearing something Ethan couldn't perceive. On those occasions, invariably, someone would arrive within the hour, a neighbor needing help, a lost hiker who'd somehow found their way to Ethan's door, once a child who'd run away from home and been drawn by instinct to the house where the special bear lived. The town accepted Ursa's presence with surprising ease, as if collective memory recognized something that individual logic might reject. Children especially were drawn to him, and Ethan found himself hosting impromptu gatherings where kids would sit in a circle while Ursa moved among them, allowing gentle touches, and somehow knowing which child needed extra attention. Parents watched with wonder rather than fear, understanding instinctively that this bear was different, special, safe. The local newspaper ran a story about Samuel's legacy, carefully skirting around the impossible elements while celebrating the continuation of something precious. Officer Jessica Brooks from the station visited one afternoon, bringing her daughter who'd been struggling with anxiety since her father's deployment overseas. The girl, no more than 7, sat quietly beside Ursa for an hour, not speaking but somehow communicating. When they left, Jessica had tears in her eyes. She smiled, she said simply. First time in 2 months. Ursa watched them go, then returned to his favorite spot on the porch, maintaining his vigil over the forest edge where wild and tame met and mingled. Margaret visited regularly, bringing old photographs and stories about Samuel and the previous bears. She taught Ethan the meaning of the symbols on the collar, though she admitted even she didn't fully understand them. They're older than any civilization we know, she said. Samuel learned them from a man who learned them from his grandmother who learned them from people who didn't write their history in books, but in bones and stones and stars. She showed him how to read Ursa's moods, though they were remarkably easy to interpret. The bear had an expressiveness that transcended species. One evening, as autumn began to paint the leaves, Lily Morgan returned with her baby. The child had grown in the weeks since their first meeting, now crawling with determination that suggested walking wasn't far off. She and Ursa resumed their strange communication immediately, the baby babbling in what almost sounded like language, while Ursa responded with gentle huffs and snuffs that seemed to carry meaning. I had to come, Lily explained. She's been trying to tell me something for days, and I finally understood she wanted to see Ursa again. They sat on the porch while the baby and bear interacted, and Lily shared that since that day in the station, her daughter had been different, more aware, more connected to the world around her. Margaret was right, Lily said. About my daughter having a gift, she knows things. Not in a scary way, but she'll reach for the phone before it rings, or she'll wave at empty air and then someone will walk around the corner. And she dreams about bears, I think. She makes this particular sound in her sleep, the same sound Ursa makes. As if to demonstrate, the baby made a soft, rumbling noise that Ursa immediately echoed, and both adults felt the hair on their arms rise, not from fear, but from witnessing something beyond ordinary understanding. As winter approached, Ursa began to change. Not physically, though he was growing at a steady rate, but behaviorally. He spent more time at the forest edge, sitting for hours, watching the trees with an intensity that suggested he was listening to something only he could hear. Ethan worried this meant Ursa was ready to return to the wild, but Margaret assured him this was normal. Each bear Samuel raised did this, she said. They're learning both sides of their nature. He'll let you know when he needs to go, and he'll let you know when he needs to return. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the world in white silence that made everything feel new and possible. Ursa loved the snow, rolling in it with abandon that was purely bear, then sitting still as a statue to watch snowflakes fall, which was something else entirely. Ethan had grown used to the duality of Ursa's nature, the way he could be wild animal one moment and something approaching human consciousness the next. He'd stopped trying to understand it intellectually and simply accepted it as part of the mystery Samuel had left behind. One snowy evening, Ethan was reading Samuel's journal again when he found a loose page he'd missed before. It was a letter addressed to the guardian who comes after. In it, Samuel explained that the bears were not pets or possessions, but partners in something ancient and essential. They remind us, Samuel wrote, that the boundary between human and nature is an illusion we created for comfort. These bears exist to show us that we're all part of the same story, all notes in the same cosmic song. Your job isn't to tame Ursa or to keep him wild, but to help him be both, because that's what the world needs, bridges between what we've separated. That night, Ethan dreamed of Samuel, though they'd never met. In the dream, the old man stood beside a telescope, pointing at the stars while a fully grown bear sat beside him. "Do you see?" Samuel asked, and suddenly Ethan did see the connections between all things, the threads of light that bound star to earth, animal to human, past to present. He woke to find Ursa sitting beside his bed, watching him with those amber eyes that held galaxies, and knew that something had shifted. Some understanding had been passed from Samuel through dream and starlight. The winter deepened, and with it came a challenge. A blizzard trapped several hikers in the mountains, and search and rescue teams were struggling in the conditions. Ursa had been restless all day, pacing and making sounds Ethan had never heard before. Finally, understanding dawned, and Ethan trusted his instinct. "You know where they are, don't you?" he asked, and Ursa immediately moved to the door. Against all protocol, against all logic, Ethan called the search coordinator and convinced them to let him and Ursa help. The bear led them through the blinding snow directly to a cave where the hikers had taken shelter. A cave the search teams had somehow missed despite passing nearby multiple times. The rescue made news beyond the local paper, though the stories focused on Ethan's tracking skills rather than the impossible truth that a bear had led them there. But the hikers knew, and they spoke in hushed tones about the bear whose eyes held human intelligence, who had found them when technology and training had failed. One of them, an elderly professor of anthropology, stayed behind after the others left. "I've read about this," he said quietly to Ethan. "Indigenous stories about spirit bears, about animals that bridge worlds. I never believed them until now." He left his card and offered to document what he'd witnessed, but Ethan knew some stories weren't meant for academic papers. As spring arrived, bringing life back to the forest, Ursa grew into his paws, becoming the size of a small adult bear, though he was not yet a year old. His intelligence had grown too, and he now seemed to understand not just commands but conversations, often positioning himself to watch Ethan's face when he spoke, occasionally making sounds that seemed like attempts at words. It should have been frightening, this bear that was more than a bear, but instead it was comforting, like having a wise friend who simply happened to be covered in fur and walked on 4 legs. Lily and her daughter, now walking and beginning to talk, visited regularly. The child, whom they'd started calling Luna for her nighttime tendencies to point at the moon and babble excitedly, had developed a vocabulary that included several sounds that only Ursa responded to. Watching them together was like watching 2 children play, if one of the children happened to be a bear. They would sit facing each other, Luna chattering in her mix of English and something else, Ursa responding with varied vocalizations that clearly meant something to the toddler. "She says Ursa tells her about the stars," Lily mentioned one day, and Ethan didn't doubt it. Margaret's visits had become less frequent as her health declined, but she made one last trip on a warm spring evening. She sat on the porch with Ethan and Ursa, watching the sunset behind the mountains. "Samuel would be so pleased," she said softly. "You've understood what he hoped someone would. Ursa isn't just a bear, and you're not just his keeper. You're both part of something larger, something that ensures the wild and the civilized never fully separate." She pulled out one last photograph, this one showing a much younger Samuel with the first Ursa. This was taken the day he found the first cub. He was just 22, working in the Forest Service. The cub's mother had been killed by poachers, and by all rights the cub should have died too. But Samuel found him, and the collar was already there, already around his neck, waiting. "Who put it there?" Ethan asked, the question he'd wanted to ask for months. Margaret smiled, the expression mysterious and knowing. Samuel spent 60 years trying to answer that question. The best he could determine was that there have always been guardians, always been bridges. The collar appears when it's needed, finds its way to the right bear and the right person. It's older than memory, older than the stories about it. Some things, Ethan, we're not meant to fully understand, we're just meant to be part of them. She stood to leave, moving slowly but with dignity. At the door, she turned back. "There will be more after Ursa. The bridge doesn't end. Make sure someone knows when the time comes. Make sure the story continues." That night, Ethan sat with Ursa under the stars, thinking about cycles and connections, about stories that transcended individual lives. Ursa sat beside him, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to correspond with specific constellations as they appeared. It was then that Ethan remembered something from Samuel's journal, a note about teaching the bears to read the stars. On impulse, he pointed at Ursa Major and said the name aloud. Ursa immediately looked up, found the constellation, and made a sound that was unmistakably recognition. They sat there for hours, Ethan naming stars and Ursa acknowledging them, and by the time they went inside, something new had passed between them, a shared language of light and wonder. Summer brought its own revelations. Ursa began disappearing into the forest for hours at a time, always returning but clearly establishing a territory, a wild life parallel to his domestic one. Ethan followed once, staying at a distance, and watched Ursa interact with other wildlife. The other animals didn't flee from him as they should have from a predator. Instead, they seemed to accept him as something unique, neither threat nor prey, but something else entirely. A deer actually approached Ursa, touched noses with him briefly, then bounded away. Birds landed near him without fear. It was as if the forest itself recognized him as belonging to both worlds and neither. During one of his forest wanderings, Ursa returned with another bear, a female who was clearly wild, clearly wary of humans, but who trusted Ursa enough to follow him to the edge of Ethan's property. She wouldn't come closer, but she waited while Ursa went to the house, ate his evening meal, then returned to her. They disappeared into the forest together, and Ethan didn't see Ursa for 3 days. When he returned, he seemed different, more mature somehow, as if he'd learned something essential about his bear nature that couldn't be taught in the company of humans. The pattern continued through the summer, days with Ethan, nights increasingly in the forest, sometimes alone, sometimes with the female bear who'd learned to trust the strange bear who lived between worlds. Ethan understood what was happening, had been preparing for it since reading Samuel's journals. Ursa was growing into his full nature, learning to be the bridge he was meant to be. It wasn't about choosing wild or tame, but about being both, fully and completely, in whatever measure the moment required. One afternoon in late summer, a crisis tested everything they'd built together. A young boy from town had gone missing, wandered off during a family camping trip. Search parties had been looking for 2 days without success. The parents were desperate, and somehow word had spread about Ursa's role in the winter rescue. They came to Ethan's house begging for help. And Ursa seemed to understand before anyone spoke. He was already at the door, already focused on something beyond human perception. This time, the search coordinator didn't hesitate to accept their help. Ursa led them deep into the forest, to areas the search parties hadn't reached, moving with purpose that suggested he knew exactly where he was going. The terrain was difficult, steep and rocky, but Ursa never hesitated. After hours of hiking, they heard it, a weak cry from a ravine that was hidden by thick brush. The boy was there, injured but alive, having fallen and been unable to climb out. The rescue was complicated, requiring ropes and careful maneuvering, but throughout it all, Ursa stayed by the boy's side, his presence seeming to calm the child's fear. When they finally got the boy to safety, he wouldn't let go of Ursa's fur, clinging to the bear as if he were a giant teddy bear come to life. The story spread despite attempts to keep it quiet. People came from neighboring towns to see the bear who rescued children, and Ethan had to establish boundaries to protect both Ursa and their privacy. But he also understood that Ursa had a purpose beyond their personal bond. The bear was meant to help, meant to bridge not just wild and tame, but fear and trust, isolation and connection. They established visiting hours of sorts, times when people could come and meet Ursa, always supervised, always with respect for his dual nature. Fall arrived with its painted leaves and crisp air, and with it came a change in Luna. Now, 3 years old, she had developed an uncanny ability to predict when Ursa would return from his forest wanderings. She would suddenly announce, "Ursa coming!" and within minutes the bear would emerge from the tree line. Her mother, Lily, had stopped being surprised by these demonstrations, accepting them as part of who her daughter was becoming. The connection between child and bear had deepened into something that defied explanation, but felt entirely natural to those who witnessed it. One evening, as they all sat on Ethan's porch, Ethan, Lily, Luna, and Ursa, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Luna said something that stopped all conversation. "Ursa says the stars are singing tonight." She said it matter-of-factly, as if it were perfectly normal for a bear to communicate such things. Ethan and Lily exchanged glances, but before they could respond, Ursa made a sound they'd never heard before, a low, musical rumble that did indeed sound like singing. That night, after Lily and Luna had gone home, Ethan lay awake listening to the sound of Ursa on the porch, making those musical sounds that seemed to echo something larger, older, more mysterious than anything in his experience. Margaret passed away as the first snows began to fall, peacefully in her sleep just as Samuel had. At her funeral, Ethan learned that she had been more than Samuel's sister. She had been a guardian herself once, to a wolf that had worn a similar collar, that had bridged worlds in its own way. The stories went back generations, a hidden history of animals and humans working together to maintain connections that modern life seemed determined to sever. She had left Ethan all of Samuel's remaining papers, and among them he found references to others. A woman in Alaska with an eagle, a man in Montana with a mountain lion, all connected by the mysterious collars, all serving as bridges. Winter settled over the land like a familiar blanket, and Ursa, now fully grown, had established a pattern that worked for everyone. He spent half his time in the forest, sometimes with the female bear who had become his companion, sometimes alone, always returning to Ethan's house when needed. He had become a legend in the region, the bear who rescued lost hikers, who comforted grieving children, who somehow knew when someone needed help. Scientists had come to study him, but their instruments and theories couldn't explain what everyone who met him instinctively understood: Ursa was exactly what he was meant to be, no more and no less. One night, as Ethan and Ursa sat watching the stars, a meteor shower began, filling the sky with streams of light. Ursa stood, moving to the center of the yard, and began making those musical sounds again, but louder, more complex, as if he were harmonizing with something only he could hear. Other sounds joined in. Wolves howling in the distance, owls calling. Even the wind seemed to carry notes that complemented Ursa's song. Ethan felt it then, what Samuel must have felt, what all the guardians through history had felt, the absolute certainty that everything was connected, that every living thing was part of a vast, incomprehensible, beautiful whole. As the meteor shower reached its peak, Ursa turned to look at Ethan, and in those amber eyes was knowledge that transcended species, transcended time, transcended everything except the fundamental truth that love and connection were the forces that held the universe together. The bear walked over and sat beside him, leaning slightly so their shoulders touched, and together they watched the stars fall like messages from eternity, each one a reminder that some things were too wonderful to fully understand, too important to forget, too magical to be anything but absolutely real. The female bear emerged from the forest, cautious but drawn by Ursa's song. She had never come so close to the house before, but tonight was different. She sat at the edge of the yard, adding her own voice to the chorus, and Ethan realized he was witnessing something ancient, something that had happened before and would happen again, as long as there were those willing to see beyond the ordinary. The meteor shower continued, the animals sang, and the world felt perfectly balanced between wild and tame, earth and sky, known and unknown. When dawn finally came, painting the world in soft pastels, the female bear retreated to the forest, but not before touching noses with Ursa in what looked like a promise. Ursa returned to the porch, curled up in his usual spot, and fell asleep with the contentment of a creature who had fulfilled its purpose, at least for one night. Ethan sat beside him, hand resting on the bear's warm fur, and thought about Samuel, about Margaret, about all the guardians who had come before and would come after. The bridge continued as it always had, as it always would, as long as there were those brave enough to stand in the space between worlds and hold them together with love and wonder. Spring came again, as it always does, bringing new life and new possibilities. Ursa's female companion had cubs, 3 of them, and Ursa brought them to the edge of the forest for Ethan to see. They were perfect, tiny versions of their parents, but one of them, the smallest, had something different about its eyes, the same amber depth, the same impossible intelligence. Ethan knew without being told that this cub would be the next bridge, would find its way to the right person when the time came. The caller would appear, as it always did, and the story would continue. Luna, now 4 and talking in complete complex sentences, came to visit with her mother. When she saw the cubs, she clapped her hands in delight. "The little one is special," she announced, pointing at the smallest cub. "Like Ursa, like me." Lily and Ethan exchanged glances over her head, understanding that Luna was right, that she was part of this story in ways they were only beginning to understand. The child walked to the edge of the forest, where the cubs played under their mother's watchful eye, and sat down. The smallest cub immediately approached her, sniffing her outstretched hand. And in that moment, a connection was made that would matter in years to come. As summer peaked, bringing long days and warm nights, Ethan received a letter from the professor who had been among the rescued hikers. He had been researching, he wrote, and had found references to similar bears throughout history, always appearing when humanity was in danger of losing its connection to the natural world. He wanted to write a book, to share the story. But Ethan knew that some stories weren't meant for mass consumption. They were meant to be lived, to be passed from guardian to guardian, from generation to generation, in the quiet spaces where magic still existed. Ursa had taken to spending more time with the cubs, teaching them in his own way about their dual heritage. Ethan watched him show them the safe paths through the forest, the places where humans and animals could meet peacefully, the importance of being both wild and gentle. The smallest cub followed Ursa everywhere, mimicking his movements, learning not just how to be a bear, but how to be a bridge. Sometimes, when the light was right, Ethan could swear he saw a faint glowing around the cub's neck, as if the collar was already there, waiting to manifest when the time was right. One evening, as the sun set in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Samuel appeared to Ethan in a dream that wasn't quite a dream. The old man stood beside his telescope, Ursa, the first Ursa, beside him, and smiled. "You've done well," he said. "Better than I hoped. The bridge is stronger now, reaching more people, touching more lives. But remember, it's not about the individual bears or the individual guardians. It's about the connection itself, the reminder that we're all part of something larger." He pointed to the sky where stars were beginning to appear. "Every star is connected to every other star by forces we can barely comprehend. We're the same. All of us, human and animal, earth and sky, connected by invisible threads of light and love." When Ethan woke, Ursa was sitting beside his bed, watching him with those knowing eyes. Outside, the smallest cub sat at the forest edge, looking up at the stars with the same intensity Ursa had shown when he was young. The cycle was continuing, the bridge extending into the future, and Ethan felt both the weight and the joy of being part of something so much larger than himself. He got up and walked outside, Ursa beside him, and together they stood in the space between wild and tame, between earth and stars, between what is and what might be. 2 chapters of mentioned part has completed. As autumn painted the world in fire colors once again, the smallest cub began spending time closer to the house, drawn by something even its mother couldn't understand. Luna visited more frequently, her connection to the cub growing stronger with each meeting. She had started drawing pictures, complex images of bears and stars and symbols that looked remarkably like those on Ursa's collar. When asked about them, she would simply say, "The bears showed me," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her mother, Lily, had stopped trying to rationalize her daughter's gifts and had started documenting them instead, creating a record that might help Luna understand her role when she was older. The town had fully embraced Ursa's presence, and he had become something of a guardian spirit for the community. When children were sick, their parents would bring them to see Ursa, and somehow they always felt better afterward. When someone was grieving, they would find their way to Ethan's house, and Ursa would sit with them in silent companionship that spoke louder than words. The local hospital had even started a program, bringing certain patients to visit Ursa, and the results defied medical explanation. One doctor, after witnessing a child with severe anxiety calm completely in Ursa's presence, had said, "I don't understand it, but I don't need to. Some healing happens beyond what we can measure." As winter approached once more, bringing with it the promise of snow and silence, something shifted in the air. Ursa became restless in a way Ethan had never seen before, pacing the porch at night, staring at the stars with an intensity that suggested he was receiving some kind of message. The smallest cub, now almost as large as Ursa had been when first found, began making the same musical sounds Ursa made, creating harmonies that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. Even Luna, visiting with her mother, seemed affected by whatever was happening. "Something big is coming," she announced one day. her young voice carrying a certainty that made the adults pause. The first snow came early and heavy, blanketing the world in white silence. That night, Ursa led Ethan into the forest, something he'd never done before. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, time stretching strange in the snow-muffled darkness. They came to a clearing Ethan had never seen before, perfectly circular, where the snow seemed to glow with its own light. In the center of the clearing was a stone, ancient and covered with the same symbols that decorated Ursa's collar. Ursa sat beside the stone and began his musical calling, louder and more complex than ever before. Other animals began arriving, the female bear and her cubs, including the special smallest one, but also deer, wolves, owls, even small creatures like rabbits and squirrels. They formed a circle around the stone, all facing inward, and added their voices to Ursa's song. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred, something that perhaps no human had seen for generations. The song grew and grew until it seemed to fill the entire forest, the entire world, and then, suddenly it stopped. In the silence that followed, the smallest cub walked to the center of the circle, to the stone, and sat down. Around its neck, glowing softly in the moonlight, was a collar. Not physical yet, but visible, waiting to become real. The cub looked at each animal in turn, then at Ethan, and in its eyes was the same ancient wisdom that lived in Ursa's gaze. The torch was being passed, not from Ursa. He would continue his role for years to come, but the preparation for the next generation had begun. The smallest cub would be ready when its time came, would find its guardian when the moment was right. As the animals dispersed, returning to their individual lives, Ursa walked with Ethan back to the house. The bear seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing the responsibility had lifted a weight he'd been carrying alone. They sat on the porch despite the cold, watching the stars wheel overhead, and Ethan understood that what he'd witnessed was part of a cycle that stretched back to the beginning of time and forward to its end. The bridges between worlds weren't just maintained by individual guardians and their companions, but by all of nature working together, each playing their part in keeping the connections alive. Luna and her mother came to visit the next day, and without being told, Luna knew something had changed. She walked straight to where the smallest cub sat at the forest edge and placed her small hand on its head. "You got your collar," she said simply, though to everyone else the cub appeared unchanged. But Luna could see what others couldn't, and her certainty was absolute. She turned to her mother and Ethan with a smile that seemed too wise for her years. "When I'm bigger, he'll need me, and I'll be ready." The cub nuzzled her hand gently, sealing a promise that wouldn't be fulfilled for years, but was already as certain as the sunrise. As the days shortened and winter deepened its hold, life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Ursa continued his dual existence, wild and tame, forest and home, teaching the smallest cub through example what it meant to be a bridge. Ethan documented everything, understanding now that he was not just a guardian, but a chronicler, keeping the story alive for those who would come after. He wrote about the impossible bears, the connections that defied explanation, the magic that lived in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually is. One clear, cold night, as the aurora borealis painted the sky in impossible greens and blues, something extraordinary happened. Ursa stood in the yard and began his song, and it was answered not just by the local wildlife, but by something else, something distant. Other songs, from other places, carried on the wind, or perhaps on something more subtle than wind. Ethan realized he was hearing the other guardians, the other bridges, all connected in a global chorus that happened perhaps once in a generation. Somewhere in Alaska, an eagle was singing. Somewhere in Montana, a mountain lion added its voice. All around the world, the bridges were checking in, confirming their presence, strengthening the web that held everything together. The song lasted until dawn. And when it ended, Ethan felt different, as if he'd been tuned to a frequency he'd never known existed. Ursa curled up beside him, exhausted but content, and they slept there on the porch as the sun rose, painting the snow-covered world in shades of pink and gold. When they woke, the female bear and her cubs were there, all of them together. A family that transcended species boundaries. The smallest cub climbed onto the porch, something its mother would never do, and curled up against Ursa, learning through closeness what it meant to trust humans, to be comfortable in both worlds. Spring returned as it always did, bringing new growth and new understanding. The smallest cub had grown remarkably, not just in size, but in presence. Other animals treated it with the same respect they showed Ursa, recognizing it as something special, something essential. Luna's visits had become daily whenever possible, her mother understanding that her daughter's education was happening as much in Ethan's yard as in any classroom. The child and the cub had developed a form of communication that went beyond words or sounds, a direct connection that would only strengthen with time. One day, as summer bloomed full and bright, an old Native American man came to visit. He'd heard the stories, he said, and wanted to see for himself if the old ways had truly returned. When he saw Ursa and the smallest cub, tears ran down his weathered cheeks. "My grandmother told me about the bridge bears," he said softly. "I thought the stories had died with her. But here they are, alive and real, and doing what they've always done, reminding us that we're not separate from nature, but part of it." He spent hours telling Ethan stories his grandmother had told him, filling in gaps in the history Samuel had tried to piece together. The man, whose name was Joseph, became a regular visitor, teaching Ethan and Luna about the indigenous understanding of the bridge animals. He explained that the collars were not human-made, but were manifestations of the animal's purpose, becoming visible when the bridge was ready to be recognized. He taught them songs that complemented Ursa's natural music, ancient melodies that had been sung to bridge animals for thousands of years. Under his guidance, Luna learned to interpret her dreams, to understand the messages the bears were sharing with her. As autumn approached once again, Ethan realized that 3 years had passed since he'd first found Ursa in that police station. 3 years that had transformed his understanding of the world, that had shown him magic was not only real, but necessary. Ursa had grown into his full size and power, a magnificent bear who moved between worlds with grace and purpose. The smallest cub, now an adolescent, was beginning to show signs that its time was approaching, though it would still be years before it would need its own guardian. One evening, as they all sat together, Ethan, Ursa, Luna, Lily, and Joseph, watching the sunset paint the sky, Luna said something that brought everything full circle. "The box in the police station," she said suddenly, as if remembering something from long ago. "It's still there, waiting." Everyone turned to look at her, but she was focused on something beyond the physical world, for the next one, after the smallest cub. And after that, the box holds all the stories, all the guardians, all the bridges. It's not bound by time because the bridges aren't bound by time. Ethan thought about that box, sitting in the lost and found room, waiting for the next person to discover it at exactly the right moment. He thought about Samuel placing it there decades ago, knowing it would be found when needed. He thought about the cycles within cycles, the stories within stories, all of them connected by invisible threads that bound past to future, human to animal, earth to sky. The bridge continued as it always had, as it always would, sustained by love and wonder and the simple recognition that we are all part of something infinitely larger than ourselves. That night, under a sky brilliant with stars, Ursa began a new song, one Ethan had never heard before. It was joined by the smallest cub, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to make the stars themselves pulse with rhythm. Luna hummed along, her young voice adding a human element to the wild music. The sound carried on the wind, reaching ears that needed to hear it, hearts that needed to remember that magic was real, that connections existed beyond what could be measured or proven. Somewhere, perhaps, another child was dreaming of bears. Another adult was feeling the pull toward something they couldn't quite name. Another animal was being born with the potential to bridge worlds. As the song faded into the night, Ursa looked at Ethan with those amber eyes that held universes, and Ethan understood that their story was both ending and beginning. Ending because the initial mystery had been solved, the cub had been found and raised and had fulfilled his purpose of continuing the bridge. Beginning because that purpose was eternal, renewable, always finding new ways to manifest. The smallest cub would grow, would find its guardian, perhaps Luna, perhaps someone else. New bridges would be built, new connections made, new reminders that the separation between human and nature was an illusion that love could dissolve. The female bear emerged from the forest one last time that season, touching noses with Ursa in a gesture of farewell. She was taking the other two cubs deep into the wilderness for the winter, but the smallest would stay, continuing its education in the dual nature it would need to master. As she disappeared into the trees, Ethan felt a pang of sadness, but also a deep satisfaction. The wild would continue, the tame would continue, and the bridge between them would continue, maintained by those brave enough to stand in both worlds simultaneously. Winter came gentle that year, with soft snows that decorated rather than buried the world. Ursa and the smallest cub had developed a routine, patrolling the borders between forest and town, checking on those who needed checking on, appearing where they were needed most. The town had fully integrated their presence into daily life, children growing up thinking it was perfectly normal for bears to attend important events, to be present at moments of joy and sorrow, to be partners rather than wildlife. The transformation was subtle but complete, a community that had remembered how to live alongside nature rather than apart from it. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, something magical happened. All the bridge animals around the world sang together again, but this time, humans heard it too. Not everyone, but those who were ready, those who were open to remembering what had been forgotten. Ethan received calls from around the country, people reporting strange, beautiful music coming from the wilderness, from their pets, from the very air itself. The bridges were strengthening, multiplying, becoming impossible to ignore. The smallest cub sat tall and proud during the song, its collar now fully visible to anyone who looked, a sign that the next generation was ready to take up the mantle. As dawn broke after that longest night, Ethan found a package on his porch with no indication of how it had arrived. Inside was a journal, blank except for the first page, which contained a note in handwriting he didn't recognize, for the next chronicler. The story continues. He understood then that his role was changing, that he was to document not just his own experience but to prepare the way for whoever would come next. The smallest cub would need its own guardian, its own chronicler, and Ethan's job was to ensure the knowledge survived, evolved, and spread. Luna arrived that morning, as if summoned, carrying her own journal filled with drawings and observations. At 5 years old, she had developed an understanding that amazed adults, a connection to the natural world that seemed to grow stronger every day. She looked at the blank journal in Ethan's hands and nodded. "That's for me," she said simply. "For when I'm older, for when the smallest cub is ready." Her certainty was absolute, and Ethan didn't doubt her. He handed her the journal and she held it carefully, understanding its importance even if she couldn't yet articulate it. The rest of winter passed in a blur of ordinary magic. Ursa continued his work as bridge and guardian. The smallest cub grew in wisdom and strength, and Luna visited daily, learning from both bears and from Ethan everything she would need to know. Joseph continued sharing the old stories, ensuring that the indigenous understanding of the bridges wouldn't be lost again. Lily documented everything with a mother's careful attention, creating a record that would help others understand when their children showed similar gifts. As spring arrived once more, bringing with it the promise of renewal, Ethan stood on his porch watching Ursa and the smallest cub play in the yard. They were wrestling gently, the older bear teaching the younger one about strength and restraint, about power and gentleness. Luna sat nearby, sketching them in her journal with surprising skill for someone so young. The scene was peaceful, ordinary even, but Ethan knew better. He was watching the continuation of something ancient and essential, something that ensured humanity wouldn't lose its way entirely, wouldn't forget that it was part of nature rather than separate from it. A car pulled up to the house, and a young couple emerged with a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. They'd heard about Ursa, they said, and felt compelled to come, though they couldn't explain why. The moment they approached, their baby began making sounds, not crying, but vocalizations that sounded remarkably like the sounds Ursa and the smallest cub made. The parents looked shocked, but Ethan just smiled. Another bridge was revealing itself. Another connection was being made. The network was growing, spreading, strengthening with each new recognition. As the couple sat with their child near the bears, watching in wonder as their baby and the animals seemed to communicate, Ethan thought about Samuel's words. The bridge continues, as it always has, as it always will. But now he understood that it wasn't just continuing, but evolving, growing stronger and more complex with each generation. The smallest cub would find its guardian, maybe Luna, maybe this new child, maybe someone not yet born. And after that, there would be others, an endless chain of connections stretching into a future where the boundary between human and nature might finally dissolve entirely. That night, as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Ursa sat beside Ethan on the porch as he had so many times before, but this time the smallest cub joined them, sitting on Ethan's other side, creating a perfect balance. Luna had fallen asleep on the porch swing, her journal clutched to her chest, dreams of bears and stars playing behind her closed eyelids. The female bear appeared at the forest edge with her other 2 cubs, now grown large and strong, and for a moment all of them were together. The bridges and the wild, the guardians and the guided, all part of the same eternal story. Ursa began to sing, soft and low, a lullaby for the world. The smallest cub joined in, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to make the stars pulse with gentle light. Even in her sleep, Luna hummed along, her voice adding the human element that completed the song. The music carried on the wind, reaching ears that needed comfort, hearts that needed hope, souls that needed reminding that they were never alone, never separate, never without connection to something larger and more beautiful than they could imagine. As the song faded into silence, Ethan closed his eyes and felt it all. The connections stretching out like a web of light, touching every living thing, binding them together in ways that science couldn't measure, but the heart knew were real. He felt Samuel's presence, and Margaret's, and all the guardians who had come before, their spirits part of the eternal bridge that death couldn't break. He felt the future guardians too, not yet born, but already part of the story, waiting for their moment to step into the space between worlds and hold them together with love. The night deepened, wrapping the world in velvet darkness punctuated by stars. Ursa and the smallest cub settled into sleep, their breathing synchronized, their dreams perhaps shared. Luna's mother arrived to take her home, carrying the sleeping child carefully, the journal still clutched in her small hands. The female bear and her cubs melted back into the forest, returning to their wild life but never truly leaving, always part of the extended family that transcended species boundaries. Ethan remained on the porch, wide awake despite the late hour, feeling the weight and wonder of his role in this ancient story. He thought about the police station, about the box that waited there, existing outside of time, ready to be discovered by the next person who needed to find it. He thought about the impossibility of it all, bears that bridged worlds, children who could communicate with animals, connections that defied every law of science he'd been taught. And yet, it was all absolutely real, more real perhaps than the ordinary world that didn't include such wonders. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Ethan made a wish, not for himself, but for the continuation of the bridges, for the strengthening of the connections, for a future where what now seemed magical would simply be recognized as natural. Ursa stirred in his sleep, making a soft sound of contentment, and the smallest cub pressed closer to Ethan's leg, seeking warmth and comfort. In that moment, everything was perfect, the balance between wild and tame, the harmony between human and nature, the bridge that connected all things holding strong and true. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in soft pastels, Ethan finally understood the true meaning of Samuel's legacy. It wasn't about the individual bears or the individual guardians. It wasn't about the mysterious collars or the impossible appearances. It was about remembering that we are all connected, all part of the same story, all notes in the same cosmic song. The bears were simply the reminder, the physical manifestation of a truth that existed whether we acknowledged it or not. They were the bridge, but we were all the bridge too, every time we chose connection over separation, love over fear, wonder over cynicism. The sun rose fully, flooding the world with golden light, and with it came a new day, a new chapter in the endless story. Ursa woke and stretched, ready for whatever the day would bring. The smallest cub bounced with youthful energy, eager to explore and learn. And Ethan stood between them, the guardian of the bridge, the keeper of the story. The human who had learned that magic wasn't about defying nature but about understanding it more deeply than most dared to try. Somewhere in town, Luna was waking up, clutching her journal, already planning her next visit. Somewhere in the forest, the female bear was teaching her cubs the ways of the wild. Somewhere in the world, other bridges were being maintained, other connections were being strengthened, other guardians were standing in the space between worlds. The story continued, as it always had, as it always would, written in starlight and fur, in human hearts and animal souls, in the eternal dance between what we know and what we're still discovering. The bridge held strong, unbreakable, beautiful, and eternal. And in a small town called Cedar Ridge, a man and two bears continued their work of reminding the world that separation was an illusion, that love was the only truth, and that magic was simply another word for paying attention to the miracles that surrounded us every single day. The epic nature of what had been discovered in that police station lost and found wasn't about drama or adventure. It was about the quiet, profound recognition that we are all part of something infinitely larger, infinitely more connected, and infinitely more wonderful than we had ever dared to imagine.